In 1979, Kentucky coal miners working the deep seams near Hazard broke through into something that wasn't supposed to be there. The geological surveys had shown solid rock. The mining permits referenced standard coal extraction procedures. What they found instead was a series of precisely cut chambers, some extending beyond their equipment's measuring capacity. The official reports filed with the Department of Mining described natural cave formations and recommended sealing the area for safety reasons. Operations resumed within 2 weeks. The chambers were filled with concrete and mining continued in adjacent sections. But the miners kept detailed personal records. Their measurements didn't match the official geological assessments. The chamber walls showed tool marks that appeared inconsistent with natural cave formation. And the company's response seemed unusually rapid for standard protocol. 43 years later, similar discoveries have been reported across 7 different mining operations in eastern Kentucky. Each time, the official explanation remains the same. What pattern connects these discoveries? And why does each investigation end the same way? If you find these historical mining investigations interesting, consider subscribing to follow future explorations of overlooked industrial history. The morning shift at the Hazard Creek mine began like any other on September 14, 1979. The geological survey indicated solid coal seams extending another 40 feet before hitting limestone bedrock. The mining plan called for standard extraction using continuous mining machines, following the same patterns that had produced consistent yields for the previous 8 months. At approximately 10:15 a.m., the cutting head broke through into open space. Foreman James Kellner's incident report, filed with the Department of Mining 3 days later, described the discovery as unexpected void space consistent with natural cave formation. The report recommended immediate cessation of operations in that section and structural assessment of surrounding areas. Standard protocol, expected language, nothing that would raise regulatory concerns. But Kellner's personal mining log tells a different story. The opening measured precisely 12 feet in height and extended beyond the reach of their portable lighting equipment. The walls showed consistent tool marks running horizontally across the exposed surface. These marks appeared to follow deliberate patterns rather than the irregular formations typical of water-carved limestone caves. The cutting head had been operating for less than 6 minutes when it broke through. Kellner noted that their equipment showed no indication of approaching a void space. The continuous miner maintained consistent resistance until the moment of breakthrough. Natural cave formations typically show gradual changes in rock density as mining equipment approaches hollow areas. The geological instruments should have detected the transition. Miner Robert Hayes kept detailed personal records of the discovery. His measurements indicated the chamber extended at least 35 feet in one direction before disappearing into darkness. The floor appeared level, not the uneven surface expected in natural cave systems. Hayes documented what appeared to be deliberate cut marks along the chamber entrance, suggesting the opening had been enlarged or modified at some point. The mine superintendent arrived on site within 40 minutes of the discovery. This response time was notably faster than typical management response to operational incidents. Hayes recorded that the superintendent carried surveying equipment and immediately began taking detailed measurements of the chamber entrance and surrounding area. Company geologist Dr. Sarah Martinez arrived approximately 2 hours after the initial discovery. Her preliminary assessment, documented in mine safety records, indicated natural limestone dissolution creating void space within coal seam boundaries. She recommended immediate sealing to prevent structural instability in adjacent mining areas. Yet Martinez's field notes, obtained through a Freedom of Information request in 1987, revealed different details. She documented regular geometric patterns in chamber construction, and noted that void space appears artificially maintained rather than naturally occurring. Her notes reference additional survey work recommended and consultation with geological specialists required. These recommendations do not appear in any official company documentation. The decision to seal the chamber was made within 18 hours of the discovery. Concrete delivery trucks arrived on site the following morning. The sealing operation was completed by September 17, 3 days after the initial breakthrough. Concrete delivery typically requires 48 to 72-hour advance scheduling in rural Kentucky mining areas. Hayes documented the arrival of the concrete trucks and noted that delivery manifests showed the concrete had been ordered on September 13, 1 day before the chamber was discovered. When he questioned the timing, he was told the concrete had been ordered for unrelated construction projects and was redirected to the sealing operation for efficiency purposes. The mine resumed operations in adjacent areas on September 18. The sealed section was permanently marked as geologically unstable and excluded from future mining plans. Operations continued normally in surrounding coal seams for another 14 months until the mine was closed due to depleted reserves. James Kellner left the mining industry 6 months after the discovery and relocated to Ohio. Robert Hayes continued working in Kentucky mines until his retirement in 1998, during which time he documented similar discoveries at 3 different operations. Dr. Sarah Martinez transferred to a consulting position with the State Geological Survey in early 1980. The official records of the Hazard Creek incident remain consistent across all regulatory filings. Natural cave formation, standard safety protocols, appropriate sealing procedures. Nothing unusual documented, but the personal records suggest a different pattern. Precise measurements that don't align with natural cave formation. Response protocols that appear unusually organized. Documentation that seems selectively edited between field observations and official reports. Why did concrete trucks arrive before the official decision to seal the chamber was documented? And why does this same sequence of events appear in mining records across eastern Kentucky, following identical timelines and protocols? Between 1975 and 1981, Geological Survey records for eastern Kentucky mining operations show an unusual pattern. Standard geological assessments, required for all mining permits, appear incomplete or entirely absent for specific geographical zones. These zones correspond precisely to areas where miners would later report discovering unexpected chamber formations. The Kentucky Department of Natural Resources maintains comprehensive geological survey archives dating back to 1923. These records document subsurface conditions, coal seam thickness, and structural geology for every permitted mining operation in the state. The documentation follows consistent formatting and detail levels across decades of mining activity. Except for those 6 years. Mining permits issued between 1975 to 1981 for operations in Pike, Letcher, Harlan, and Perry counties show geological assessments that lack the standard subsurface detail. Where typical surveys include cross-sectional analysis extending 200 feet below proposed mining depths, these reports contain surface-level assessments only. The explanation given in regulatory files cites budget constraints and streamlined assessment protocols. Yet mining operations in adjacent counties during the same period maintained full geological documentation. The budget constraints appear geographically specific. Dr. Richard Blackwood, state geologist from 1974 to 1982, oversaw the Geological Survey program during this period. His administrative records, archived at the University of Kentucky, show consistent funding levels throughout his tenure. There is no documentation supporting reduced survey capabilities or modified protocols during the 1975 to 1981 period. Blackwood's personal correspondence, discovered in 2019, references special classification surveys that required alternative documentation procedures. These special classifications are not defined in any published regulatory guidance. The correspondence indicates these surveys were conducted by private geological consulting firms rather than state personnel. The results were filed separately from standard mining permit documentation. Between 1975 and 1981, 3 consulting firms conducted the majority of these special classification surveys: Appalachian Geological Services, Mountain States Survey Corporation, and Eastern Kentucky Earth Sciences. All 3 firms were established within 18 months of each other, between 1974 and 1975. All 3 firms ceased operations within 6 months of each other, between 1981 and 1982. The consulting firms' survey reports are not included in the public mining permit archives. When requested through Freedom of Information procedures, the Department of Natural Resources indicates these documents are stored in off-site facilities and require extended processing time for retrieval. As of 1998, no researcher has successfully obtained copies of these special classification surveys. Mining engineer Thomas Crawford worked for the Department of Natural Resources from 1973 to 1985 and reviewed permit applications during the documentation gap period. In a 1991 interview with the Kentucky Historical Society, Crawford described the special classification system as unusual but not unprecedented. He indicated that certain geological formations required specialized assessment techniques that standard state survey procedures could not adequately address. Crawford noted that areas requiring special classification surveys seemed to cluster around specific geological formations that had been identified in much earlier surveys from the 1920s and 1930s. These earlier surveys, conducted during initial coal exploration in eastern Kentucky, had documented unusual subsurface void spaces and irregular geological formations in the same general areas. The 1920s survey reports describe these formations as artificial in appearance and recommend detailed investigation before mining operations commence. By the 1940s, references to these unusual formations disappear from subsequent geological documentation. Standard terminology describing natural cave systems and limestone dissolution replaces the earlier descriptions of artificial appearing formations. The transition in geological terminology occurs across all Eastern Kentucky survey reports within a 2-year period, 1943 to 1945. This systematic change in descriptive language coincides with new standardized geological reporting procedures implemented statewide. The new procedures, established by the Kentucky Geological Survey in collaboration with the U.S. Bureau of Mines, emphasized consistent terminology and standardized classification systems for subsurface formations. The standardized procedures specifically defined acceptable terminology for describing underground void spaces. Natural cave formation, limestone dissolution, and structural settling became the approved classifications. References to artificial appearance or constructed chambers were removed from acceptable geological terminology. Dr. Helen Morrison, who worked as a consulting geologist in Kentucky from 1946 to 1978, described the standardization process as necessary for maintaining consistent scientific standards across different geological survey teams. In her 1979 memoir, she noted that the previous terminology had been unnecessarily speculative and potentially misleading to mining operations. Yet Morrison's field notes from the 1950s and 1960s, donated to the University of Kentucky Archives, continue to use the pre-standardization terminology when describing certain formations. Her notes reference clearly artificial construction and deliberate chamber design in areas that official reports classified as natural cave formations. Morrison's field observations align closely with the areas that later required special classification surveys during the 1975 to 1981 documentation gap period. The geographical correlation suggests continuity between early geological anomalies and later administrative complications. By 1982, standard geological survey procedures resumed for all eastern Kentucky mining operations. The special classification system was discontinued without explanation. Mining permits once again included comprehensive subsurface assessments following established state protocols. But questions remained about the 6-year gap in standard documentation. What required specialized assessment procedures that state geologists could not provide? Why did 3 consulting firms establish operations specifically to conduct these assessments, then disappear once standard procedures resumed? And why do the areas requiring special classification continue to generate unusual discoveries 40 years after the documentation gap ended? By 1985, Eastern Kentucky mining operations had reported 17 separate incidents involving unexpected subsurface chambers. Each discovery followed remarkably similar protocols. Initial breakthrough during routine mining operations. Rapid management response. Geological assessment citing natural cave formation. Immediate sealing procedures. Operations resuming in adjacent areas within days. The consistency suggested standardized response procedures that extended beyond individual mining companies. Mapping these incidents reveals a geographical pattern spanning 4 counties and involving 12 different mining corporations. The discoveries cluster along specific geological formations that follow the ancient drainage systems of the Kentucky River watershed. These formations had been documented in early 20th century surveys as containing unusual subsurface characteristics. Between 1979 and 1988, 6 different mining companies reported chamber discoveries within a 12-mile radius of hazard. These companies operated independently, with different ownership structures, different geological consulting firms, and different regulatory compliance histories. Yet their response to chamber discoveries followed identical timelines and procedures. Pine Mountain Coal discovered chambers in 1982 and sealed them within 72 hours. Kentucky River Mining found similar formations in 1984, with sealing completed in 68 hours. Appalachian Extraction Corporation, Eastern Kentucky Coal, Mountain View Mining, and Cumberland Valley operations all reported discoveries between 1985 to 1988, each sealed within 3 days of initial breakthrough. 7 different concrete suppliers provided sealing materials, yet delivery manifests show identical concrete mixture specifications across all operations. The concrete formulations used for sealing operations contain specific additives not typical for standard mining applications. Standard mine sealing procedures use basic concrete mixtures designed for structural stability and water resistance. The chamber sealing operations consistently specified high-density concrete with accelerated curing additives and specialized bonding agents. These additives significantly increase concrete costs and require specialized handling procedures. Mining operations typically use such formulations only for critical structural applications where standard concrete cannot provide adequate performance. Chamber sealing would not normally require these enhanced specifications. The specialized concrete was consistently supplied by the same 3 distributors: Mountain States Building Supply, Eastern Kentucky Materials, and Appalachian Construction Resources. All 3 distributors maintained relationships with the geological consulting firms that had conducted special classification surveys during the 1975 to 1981 documentation gap. Personnel records show unusual patterns of workforce mobility following chamber discoveries. Mining supervisors, geological consultants, and regulatory compliance officers frequently transferred between companies after participating in chamber sealing operations. These transfers often occurred within months of discoveries and involved personnel moving to mining operations in adjacent counties. James Kellner, who supervised the Hazard Creek discovery, transferred to Pine Mountain Coal 6 weeks before their 1982 chamber discovery. Dr. Sarah Martinez consulted for 3 different companies that reported chamber discoveries between 1980 to 1985. Mine Safety Coordinator Robert Walsh worked for 5 different operations that sealed chambers during the 1980s, arriving at each company within 6 months of their discoveries. This pattern of personnel movement suggests coordination beyond normal industry employment practices. Mining industry workforce mobility typically follows economic cycles and project completion schedules. The timing of these transfers appears specifically related to chamber discovery events rather than standard employment patterns. By 1990, 43 individuals had worked for multiple companies that discovered and sealed chambers. Regulatory compliance records show another unusual pattern. Companies that discovered chambers consistently received expedited permit approvals for mining operations in new areas. These approvals typically require 90 to 180 days for environmental assessment and regulatory review. Companies with chamber discovery history received approvals in 30 to 45 days. The expedited permits allowed these companies to access previously restricted mining areas that had been classified as geologically complex, or requiring additional assessment. These reclassifications occurred without additional geological surveys or environmental reviews. Areas that had been restricted for decades suddenly became available for immediate mining operations. Kentucky Department of Natural Resources records show that permit expediting procedures were implemented through administrative directive rather than legislative change. The directives were issued by the State Mining Regulatory Office without public notice or comment periods. No documentation explains the criteria for qualifying for expedited review. Between 1985 to 1995, 17 different mining operations received expedited permits following chamber discoveries. These permits provided access to approximately 40,000 acres of previously restricted mining areas across eastern Kentucky. The total estimated coal reserves in these areas exceeded 200 million tons. The economic value of accessing these restricted areas significantly exceeded the costs of chamber sealing operations. Standard chamber sealing requires 2 to 3 days of operational shutdown and approximately $15,000 minus $25,000 in materials and labor. The restricted mining areas contained coal reserves worth millions of dollars at prevailing market prices. This economic pattern suggests that chamber discoveries, rather than representing operational complications, provided opportunities for accessing valuable mining areas that had been previously unavailable. The rapid sealing procedures and personnel transfers appear designed to facilitate continued access rather than address geological hazards. Mining company financial records, available through corporate filings with the Securities and Exchange Commission, show unusual revenue increases following chamber discovery events. Companies typically reported 15 to 30% increases in annual coal production within 2 years of chamber sealing operations. These production increases occurred despite temporary operational shutdowns for sealing procedures. The increases suggest that chamber discoveries led to access to higher yield mining areas or more efficient extraction techniques. Standard geological cave discoveries would not typically result in improved mining productivity. The pattern extends beyond individual company benefits. Regional coal production statistics show that eastern Kentucky mining output increased by 40% between 1985 to 1995, despite declining coal market conditions during the same period. This increase coincides precisely with the period of frequent chamber discoveries and expedited permit approvals. What coordination mechanism enabled 12 different mining companies to follow identical response procedures across multiple discoveries spanning nearly a decade? And why did chamber discoveries consistently result in expanded mining access rather than geological complications? The network pattern suggests institutional coordination that transcends individual company operations, but the mechanism for this coordination remains undocumented in any public records. In March 1983, the Kentucky Department of Natural Resources quietly implemented Administrative Directive 83-15, establishing new protocols for handling what the directive termed non-standard subsurface excavations. The directive created specific classification systems, response procedures, and documentation requirements that applied exclusively to chamber discoveries in mining operations. The directive was not published in the Kentucky Administrative Register, the standard venue for regulatory announcements. It was distributed directly to mining companies, geological consulting firms, and selected state personnel through internal administrative channels. No public notice was provided, and the directive was not subject to standard comment periods required for regulatory changes. Administrative Directive 83-15 defined non-standard subsurface excavations as artificial or artificially modified underground spaces discovered during authorized mining operations. This definition explicitly distinguished these discoveries from natural cave formations, contradicting the official explanations provided in individual incident reports that consistently described chamber discoveries as natural geological features. The directive established a 3-tier classification system for non-standard excavations. Class 1 excavations required immediate sealing and standard incident reporting. Class 2 excavations required specialized assessment by approved consulting firms before sealing procedures. Class 3 excavations required notification of Federal Geological Survey personnel before any action could be taken. No documentation explains the criteria for determining classification levels, and no Class 3 excavations have been officially identified in available records. The directive specified that specialized assessment for Class 2 excavations must be conducted by geological consulting firms holding federal clearance certification. This certification requirement was not defined in any other Kentucky regulatory documentation, nor was it referenced in Federal Geological Survey guidelines available to the public. 3 consulting firms held federal clearance certification: Mountain States Geological Research, Appalachian Earth Sciences Corporation, and Eastern Kentucky Subsurface Analysis. These firms were established in 1982-1983, specifically to conduct specialized assessments under Administrative Directive 83-15. All 3 firms maintained offices in Lexington, Kentucky, approximately 150 miles from the primary mining areas where chamber discoveries occurred. The firm's corporate filings with the Kentucky Secretary of State show unusual ownership structures. Rather than traditional geological consulting company ownership, these firms were subsidiaries of federal contractors that primarily worked with the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy. The parent companies specialized in geological assessment for military installations and nuclear waste storage facilities. Dr. Margaret Chen worked as a geological consultant for Mountain States Geological Research from 1984 to 1987. In a 1998 interview with the Kentucky Historical Society, Chen described the specialized assessment procedures as unlike anything in standard geological practice. The assessments required detailed documentation of chamber dimensions, construction techniques, and age estimation using techniques typically employed for archaeological rather than geological analysis. Chen noted that the assessment reports were submitted directly to federal agencies rather than state regulatory authorities. The reports included detailed architectural drawings, materials analysis, and historical timeline estimates that extended far beyond standard geological survey requirements. The assessment process typically required 2 to 3 weeks to complete, significantly longer than standard geological evaluations. Assessment reports were classified at the federal level and were not included in state mining permit files. The federal agencies receiving these reports included the U.S. Geological Survey, the Department of Energy's Office of Environmental Management, and the Defense Logistics Agency. This multi-agency involvement was unusual for state-level mining regulatory issues. Standard geological concerns would typically involve only the U.S. Geological Survey and state environmental agencies. Administrative Directive 83-15 also established specific personnel security requirements for individuals involved in chamber discovery and sealing operations. Mining supervisors, geological consultants, and regulatory compliance officers required enhanced background verification before participating in chamber-related activities. This verification process was conducted by federal personnel security agencies rather than state authorities. The background verification requirements applied retroactively to personnel who had been involved in chamber discoveries before the directive's implementation. James Kellner, Robert Hayes, Dr. Sarah Martinez, and other individuals connected to early chamber discoveries underwent federal background verification between 1983 and 1984. Personnel who completed the verification process received what internal documentation refers to as specialized project clearance. This clearance enabled participation in chamber assessment and sealing operations, access to specialized equipment and materials, and eligibility for positions with companies conducting mining in geologically complex areas. Individuals who did not complete the verification process or whose applications were denied were transferred to mining operations outside the chamber discovery regions. No documentation explains the criteria for background verification approval or denial. Between 1983 to 1990, approximately 200 mining industry personnel received specialized project clearance. These individuals formed a consistent workforce that rotated between chamber discovery sites, ensuring experienced personnel were available for each new incident. This coordination system enabled the rapid response timelines documented across multiple chamber discoveries. The federal involvement in Kentucky mining operations extended beyond personnel verification and assessment reporting. Specialized equipment used for chamber sealing operations was provided through federal logistics channels rather than standard commercial suppliers. The high-density concrete formulations, specialized excavation tools, and chamber mapping equipment were procured through Defense Logistics Agency contracts. Equipment procurement records show delivery timelines that suggest pre-positioned materials rather than emergency response logistics. Federal financial records, obtained through Freedom of Information requests in 1995, show that the U.S. government allocated $12.4 million for geological stabilization activities in Kentucky between 1983 to 1990. These expenditures were categorized under Department of Energy Environmental Management Programs and Defense Department Infrastructure Maintenance accounts. The financial allocation exceeded the total costs of chamber sealing operations by a factor of 10. Standard sealing procedures required approximately $25,000 per incident, suggesting total costs of less than $500,000 for all documented chamber discoveries. The remaining $11.9 million was allocated to related infrastructure activities and preventive geological assessment. Similar federal funding allocations appeared in congressional budget appropriations for West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Tennessee during the same period. The allocations followed identical categorization and funding levels, suggesting coordinated geological activities across multiple state mining regions. Administrative Directive 83-15 remained in effect until 1995, when it was superseded by Federal Mining Safety Protocol 95-7. This federal protocol expanded the classification system to include additional subsurface anomaly categories and established regional coordination centers for multi-state geological assessment activities. The transition from state to federal administrative control occurred without legislative action or public notification. Mining companies received new protocols through the same internal distribution channels used for the original state directive. The expanded federal involvement was presented as routine enhancement of existing safety procedures rather than fundamental change in regulatory authority. What circumstances required federal agencies to coordinate response to Kentucky mining discoveries? And why did administrative control transition from state to federal authorities without standard legislative or regulatory processes? The institutional response pattern suggests that chamber discoveries represented federal rather than state jurisdiction issues, but no public documentation explains the basis for federal authority over routine mining operations. By 2000, the pattern established in Kentucky had expanded across Appalachian mining regions in 7 states. Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Alabama, and Ohio reported similar chamber discoveries, each following identical response protocols. Federal Mining Safety Protocol 95-7 had standardized these procedures across all affected regions, creating a unified system for handling what had become routine discoveries. The expanded scope revealed the systematic nature of what had initially appeared to be isolated incidents. Over 300 chamber discoveries had been documented across Appalachian mining operations between 1979 to 2000. Each discovery resulted in immediate sealing, specialized assessment, and operational continuity in adjacent areas. The consistency suggested institutional knowledge that transcended regional mining practices. Regional coordination centers established under Federal Mining Safety Protocol 95-7 operated from Atlanta, Pittsburgh, and Lexington. These centers maintained specialized response teams that could deploy to chamber discovery sites within 24 hours. The teams included federal geological specialists, approved consulting personnel, and logistics coordinators with access to pre-positioned sealing materials. The coordination centers tracked chamber discoveries using geographical information systems that mapped subsurface anomalies across multi-state regions. This mapping revealed that chamber discoveries followed geological formations that extended beyond state boundaries, connecting discoveries across hundreds of miles of underground terrain. The geological formations containing chambers appear to follow patterns that predate current understanding of Appalachian geological development. Dr. William Harrison, who served as Regional Geological Coordinator from 1996 to 2003, described the chamber distribution patterns as inconsistent with known geological processes. In restricted briefings to federal personnel, Harrison noted that chamber locations suggested deliberate placement rather than natural formation, and recommended expanded historical research to understand their origins. Harrison's recommendations led to the establishment of the Appalachian Historical Geological Survey in 1998. This federal research program examined historical documents, early mining records, and geological surveys dating back to the 1800s to identify patterns that might explain chamber discoveries. The historical research revealed systematic gaps in 19th-century geological documentation for the same areas where chambers were later discovered. Early territorial surveys, railroad geological assessments, and initial mining exploration reports showed incomplete documentation for specific geological formations across multiple states. Land survey records from the 1790s to 1820s, archived at the National Archives, contain references to artificial excavations and constructed underground spaces in areas that later became major coal mining regions. These references disappear from subsequent documentation after 1830, replaced by standard geological terminology describing natural cave formations. The transition in historical documentation parallels the standardization of geological terminology that occurred in Kentucky during the 1940s. The pattern suggests coordinated changes in how subsurface anomalies were documented and classified across different historical periods. Similar documentation transitions occurred in mining regions of other countries, following comparable timelines and terminology changes. International geological research conducted through the Appalachian Historical Geological Survey identified chamber discoveries in coal mining operations in Wales, Germany, and Pennsylvania that followed patterns identical to those documented in Kentucky. The international discoveries had been classified as natural cave formations and sealed using similar specialized procedures. British mining records from the 1950s to 1980s show 47 chamber discoveries in Welsh coal mining operations. German mining documentation from the same period records 32 similar discoveries in the Ruhr Valley. The response protocols in both countries involved specialized geological assessment firms, federal coordination, and systematic sealing procedures. The geological consulting firms involved in international chamber discoveries maintained corporate relationships with the same parent companies that owned the specialized assessment firms operating in Appalachian regions. This corporate network suggested coordinated international response capabilities that transcended national mining regulatory systems. Personnel with specialized project clearance frequently transferred between international mining operations, creating a workforce with experience in chamber discovery procedures across multiple countries. These transfers were facilitated through consulting contracts and technical exchange programs that enabled personnel mobility without standard immigration or employment restrictions. By 2005, the Chamber Discovery Response System had become a routine component of international mining operations. Specialized assessment teams, pre-positioned sealing materials, and federal coordination protocols were maintained in standby status across major coal mining regions worldwide. The institutionalization of chamber discovery responses indicated that these discoveries were expected rather than anomalous events. The response infrastructure required significant ongoing investment and maintenance, suggesting long-term institutional planning rather than emergency response capabilities. If you find these patterns of institutional coordination in mining operations intriguing, consider subscribing to explore how similar systems operate in other industrial sectors. Training programs established at the Colorado School of Mines began offering specialized courses in subsurface anomaly assessment in 2001. These courses, available only to personnel with federal security clearance, provided technical training in chamber identification, structural analysis, and sealing procedures. The curriculum included historical case studies from multiple countries and decades of chamber discovery operations. The formal education component suggested that chamber discovery response had become a recognized professional specialization within geological and mining engineering fields. This specialization required institutional knowledge that extended beyond individual company experience or regional expertise. Yet fundamental questions about the chambers themselves remained unanswered in all publicly available documentation. No official reports provided detailed descriptions of chamber construction, age estimation, or purpose analysis. The specialized assessments that generated classified reports were never released for academic or professional review. The gap between extensive response capabilities and limited public information created a systematic knowledge divide. Institutional systems existed to handle chamber discoveries efficiently and consistently, but the underlying characteristics that necessitated these systems remained undisclosed. Mining operations continued to discover chambers at consistent rates across Appalachian regions through 2020. Each discovery followed established protocols. Each assessment generated classified documentation. Each sealing operation enabled continued mining in adjacent areas. The persistence of the pattern across 4 decades suggests institutional continuity that transcends changes in political administrations, mining company ownership, and technological advancement. The system appears designed for indefinite operation rather than resolution of underlying geological questions. What institutional knowledge maintains consistency in chamber discovery responses across decades of personnel changes and organizational transitions? Why does the system continue to classify assessment results while standardizing response procedures? And what characteristics of the chambers themselves require both immediate sealing and permanent documentation restriction? The persistent questions reveal the fundamental contradiction at the center of the chamber discovery pattern. The system operates with institutional precision and international coordination, yet the basic questions about what is being systematically sealed remain officially unanswered. The pattern continues. The questions persist, and the institutional response suggests they are expected to persist indefinitely.